I'm going to show you how to make your workflow schedule another workflow. Let's get started. Hi everyone, I'm Brian Watrous from VVork. If this is your first time here and you want to learn about automating, programming, and monitoring in VMware environments, you're in the right place. Start now by subscribing and click the bell so that you don't miss a thing. In this video, we're going to see how to use the schedule workflow schema element. But before we do, take a look up there. You'll find a YouTube card that has a playlist for all the videos in this series. We're actually taking a look at numerous ways of scheduling within your workflows and or sleeping and or waiting. So take a look at the playlist, but let's move onwards. As you can see here in this series, we're going to be talking about a number of different schema elements, but this time in this video, we're going to be looking at this one right here, which is the schedule workflow schema element. So let's go take a look at it in the labs. As you can see, I'm already logged into vRealize Orchestrator. Before we go into library workflows to create a workflow to programmatically schedule calling another workflow, I thought I would take a few moments to show you how to manually schedule workflow. Now, if you already know how to do that and you'd like to jump ahead, take a look in the YouTube description down below. I'll put in a time index so that you can jump to the next section. But again, if you've never manually scheduled a workflow, let's take a look at how you do that. So to manually schedule a workflow, what I'm going to do is go to Library, Workflows, and in here I need to find the workflow that I want to schedule. Now the workflow I want to schedule here is actually this one called Hello World, but if you need to search for it, you could search for it by name or by using tags or other such mechanisms. But I'll just type hello, and as you can see, it has narrowed down from the 474 workflows I have down to the one that I want to schedule. Now, before we actually manually schedule this workflow, let's take a quick look at it here. So we'll open up the workflow, and in the workflow, I'd like to point out that this workflow has no inputs and no outputs. You'll see in a few moments why I'm pointing that out. As we can see, this workflow has a very simple schema. All it has in it, besides the start and end schema elements, is a single scriptable task called Say Hello. If we click on Say Hello and examine it, you will notice that it too has no inputs and no outputs. But what it does have is a tiny little bit of JavaScript code. So if we go to the scripting tab and look at the code, as you can see, all this workflow is going to do is simply log a message. It's going to log the message, Hello World. All right, so that's all there really is to this workflow. So I'm going to simply close this workflow. And once again, we can see all the workflows. If I wanted to, I could filter them down just to the one, but we already know that Hello World is the workflow that I want to manually schedule. So what I'm going to do next is go to the Hello World workflow. Instead of opening it, I'm going to go to the Actions drop-down list of choices. And as you can see, the very first choice is to schedule invocation of this workflow. So I'll go ahead and click Schedule. And when I schedule the workflow, it starts by reminding me the name of the workflow I'm calling, in case I forgot it from a few moments ago. But then it starts asking me some questions. The first thing it wants to know is what would I like to call this scheduled task? So we're creating a scheduled task to launch the Hello World workflow. So why don't we give the scheduled task a name, something such as Say Hello in the Future. Nice and simple. And additionally, we get to supply a description. The description will presumably be a bit more detailed, so I'll slightly change mine here. So it's up to you what you want to name the scheduled task. It's up to you what description you want to enter. What you do have to do is select when you want the workflow to run. Again, that's the whole point of scheduling this workflow, is you need to specify at what time and date you want the workflow to run. So we'll go to the start field here. We'll click on select a date. And as you can see, we are presented with a date time picker. Up on the top, I get to pick the date that I want the workflow to run. I'll go ahead and choose today, February 12th. And then down below, I get to choose the time at which I want this workflow to run. Now I'm intentionally going to bump this up a couple of minutes so that I can spend a few more moments talking about these next two fields. Now, if I end up talking too long, about these next two fields and I were to set this next field to no, then that would mean if I've set the time that this workflow is supposed to run in the past, which again, if I keep talking here, that time is going to be in the past, then this workflow would not run. Chances are, in most cases, even if you accidentally set the time too far in the past, you still want the workflow to run. So let's change that to yes. Then the other thing that we need to do here is to specify the schedule. So currently, this workflow that I'm scheduling is only going to run once. That's what no recurrence means. But as you can see, I can choose to have it run every minute, every day, every hour, and so forth. But I'm just going to leave it set as it was and click the Create button. And once we're done clicking the Create button, as you can see here on the screen, we are now in the Activity Scheduled section, and this card here is describing the scheduled task we just created. So again, it says the name of our scheduled task, it shows us the description, and additional information including when the workflow is scheduled to run, and additionally it says that currently this the scheduled task is still pending. It hasn't occurred yet. So what we're going to do here through the magic of video editing is to jump forward in time. In 3, 2, 1. Hang on, that didn't work. Let me try again. One more time. Okay, now that I've allowed a few minutes to pass, I'm going to click this lovely refresh button and notice what happens to the status field. Currently it says pending, but if I click the refresh button, let's see what happened to my manually scheduled workflow invocation. So here we go in 3, 2, watch the status field in 3, 2, 1. And you'll notice that it now reports that the scheduled task is finished. It's done. Let's go back to the workflows again. So library workflows. Here's my workflow again that we just manually invoked. Now, there's one other thing I want you to see that didn't show up in the case of this particular workflow called Hello World. What we didn't see is due to the fact that Hello World has no input parameters. But if we were to schedule another workflow, just picking the one that happens to be right next to it, if we schedule this workflow, so actions, schedule, you'll notice that it asks the same questions that it did before, but in the case of this workflow, down below, it's asking me some questions about the workflow we're calling. Now, in this case here, it's asking me to select some VM, but generically, what's happening down here in this section, forget the fact that it's asking for a VM. In general, what's happening down in this section here is if the workflow I'm scheduling has any input parameters, I need to specify the values for those input parameters now while I'm scheduling the workflow, because the whole point of scheduling the workflow is to run the workflow sometime in the future, and I might not be around. So if you schedule a workflow to run in the future and that workflow has input parameters, down here in the workflow section is where you'd specify the input parameters for the workflow. Okay, so let's click cancel. As you can see, we're back here at the library workflow section, and you've now seen how to manually schedule a workflow, but that's not why you came here to watch this video. Even if you're using VRO 7 and using the older Java-based VRO client, even though I haven't shown you exactly how to manually schedule a workflow there, you could pretty easily figure that out. Back in the old client, you just right-click the workflow you want to schedule, and in the pop-up menu, you choose to schedule the workflow. So manually scheduling a workflow is not terribly tricky. It does get a little trickier, though, when you want to programmatically schedule a workflow, and that is presumably what you came here to this video to see. So let's take a look at how to create a workflow that programmatically schedules the invocation of another workflow. So to do that, again, we go to Library Workflows, and we're going to create a new workflow, and we'll call this workflow Scheduling Using Schedule Workflow. Okay, so this is a workflow that's going to perform scheduling by calling the schedule workflow schema element. So let's click create, and ordinarily I would do things here such as setting the tags for this workflow, and I would definitely set a description because we always type descriptions for every single Orchestrator workflow that we create. However, I'm going to shortcut that this time to save you a little time. Instead, what I'm going to do is jump to the Schema tab, because this is where we're going to find the where we're going to find the schema element called schedule workflow. So this is the schema element that allows us within our workflow schema to say that I want my workflow schema to call some other workflow. So we're simply going to drag schedule workflow into our workflow schema, drop it on the arrow between the start and end schema elements. And over here on the right side, it asks me some of the usual questions about the schema element, including the name, which will determine what the label is going to be over here. So why don't we change that label to something a little more descriptive, such as say hello in the future. And additionally, there are other fields here, but jumping right to the part that's of interest to us here, notice that whereas normally with many of these other schema elements, the next section we would see wouldn't be labeled options, instead it would be labeled inputs and outputs. So a schedule workflow schema element is different. A schedule workflow schema element doesn't ask for the usual inputs and outputs that we would see if instead we use something such as workflow element, because schedule workflow is going to work a little differently. For schedule workflow, what we're going to see is a section labeled options. If we expand it, you'll notice that it asks us to specify two inputs, not to the workflow that we're calling, but rather to schedule workflow itself. Schedule workflow always has two pieces of information that we need to deal with. One is a piece of input that we supply to schedule workflow. The other is a piece of output that we get from schedule workflow. The input, as you can see here, is known internally within schedule workflow, is known internally as workflow schedule date, and that is a variable of type date. So this input that it calls workflow schedule date is a date object that allows us to specify a time and date. In this particular context, we're going to use it to specify a time and date in the future. So what we need to do in our workflow is to have a corresponding input, or it could be a variable, formerly known as attributes. So we need to link the schedule workflow's input, called workflow schedule date, to a variable of our own. So to do so, we're going to go over here where it says select variable. We'll click here, and you'll notice that I don't have anything to select here except for to create something new. Now, if I wanted to, before I dragged schedule workflow into my schema, I could have gone to variables to create a variable, again, formerly known as attributes, or I could go to the input outputs tab to create an input before I dragged in the schedule workflow, in which case if I had done that, I could have selected that variable or that input here. But I don't have to create them in advance. I can instead simply click create new, which I'm going to do. And in the window that pops up, I can choose to either create a variable, again, formerly known as attributes, or an input. Now, in this particular case here, I'm going to choose to create an input because I would like whoever is calling my workflow to be able to set the time and date that will be that future point in time when our workflow or scheduling is going to get called. If I instead created a variable, then the user calling my workflow wouldn't have any control over that. Instead, the workflow developer, would set the time and date. So I'm going to create an input, and my variable can be, or my input in this case, can be named exactly the same as the variable inside of schedule workflow, or if I wanted to, I could change this here. To keep things simple, I'm just going to go with the default name. So the name of my input is going to match the name of the input defined by schedule workflow. And I get a field here where I can type a description. So I could type something such as the time and date in the future when we want Hello World to run. Now, if you're familiar with the VRO7 world, that description would become the label that the user would see in the input form when they run our workflow. Now this is VRO8 that I'm using here, so it works a little differently. I'm still going to type a description because descriptions are good things to type, but to control what the user's actually going to see, the label for this question we're asking, you would actually go to input form to do that in VRO8. But that's not the point of this particular video, so I'm going to skip that step. Instead, I'll simply click Create. By the way, I'm not changing the type of my input because my type has to match the type defined by Schedule Workflow. So I'll simply click Create, and I've now set up the input that Schedule Workflow Schema element requires. Now I also need to hook up to an output that Schedule Workflow Schema element returns, which is an output it calls Schedule Task. Now again, I could go to the Variables tab to predefine my variable, again formerly known as attributes, or I could go to the Input Outputs tab and create an output. But one way or another, I need a variable or an output in my workflow to hook up to the variable called, the output's called Scheduled Task that's defined by Schedule Workflow. So again, I haven't done that. I have not predefined it. So instead, I'm going to click Select Variable. Since I haven't predefined it, I don't get to choose it. Instead, I'm going to choose to create a new. Well, I could do an output. In other videos in the series, I'll explain why I'm choosing this, but I'm intentionally going to choose to create a variable. If later on I want to expose whatever the scheduled task thing is to whoever or whatever is calling my workflow, later on I can copy this variable to another output. But by making this a variable, it's going to keep things nice and flexible for me. And again, I should type a description. So this here is the VRO task object that's created from calling a scheduled task, schedule workflow. There we go. By the way, if you know what a VC: task is, this is not a VC: task. This is not the vCenter concept of a task. This is the Orchestrator concept of a task. We'll talk more about it in a bit. Now, I'm not going to set the value because Schedule Workflow is going to set the value. Instead, I'll just leave that blank and I'll click Create. So I've filled out the details up above. I've specified the workflow schedule date, and I'm capturing the scheduled task that I get in return. But crucially, what I now need to do is to go to this workflow section and pick which workflow I'm scheduling. So I'm not scheduling my own workflow, I'm scheduling another workflow, which happens to be showing up right here in the list. If you need to, you can always search for, hang on, let me scroll here. You can always search for the workflow with tags or the name of the workflow. So here's Hello World. That's the workflow I want to schedule. So I'll simply select it. And notice that behind the scenes, Orchestrator has gone out and interrogated the signature of the Hello World workflow to find out what inputs and additionally what outputs it has. And as a result, we can see that it's in this section here is telling me that that particular workflow, Hello World, does not have any inputs. Now, if there were inputs to the Hello World workflow or whatever workflow I'm scheduling, I would have to specify the values of those inputs right here, right now, because this workflow, this Hello World workflow, when it runs in the future, I'm not going to be around to supply the inputs. So I've got to supply them now. So Hello World has no inputs. So for our purposes here, there's nothing left to do. Now, you may be wondering why there's no section here labeled outputs. Even if the Hello World workflow had outputs, I would still not see the outputs of Hello World or whatever workflow I'm scheduling. You won't see in the workflow section, you will not see outputs because in the case of running a workflow, scheduling it as we're doing here, we may not even be around, this workflow that we're writing may not be around when the other workflow is done running. So in that sense, there's no point in trying to catch its outputs. So again, Hello World doesn't have any outputs, but if it did, there's no provision here for capturing the outputs. Now, if you're throwing up your hands in despair right now, don't worry. if the workflow we're scheduling has outputs, even though we don't have a section here to catch those outputs, you can still get the outputs of the scheduled workflow. You just need to get those by going through the task object. All right, so we're almost done. There's also this section down here for exception handling, but we're not going to do any exception handling here. Instead, we're just going to pretty this up a bit. Why don't we click the validate button to see that everything looks okay? We'll click close. Why don't we save this workflow? We'll save it, and let's go ahead and run the workflow, which I can do by closing and running the workflow from the main workflow screen, or I can run the workflow right here by clicking run. So we run the workflow, and as you'll recall, the workflow that we just wrote has a single input called workflow schedule date. We also supplied the description for that input, but again, because this is VRO8, the input description doesn't show up here automatically. If you want to set up a label, if instead of showing the name of the input here, you'd rather see a label, again, that's what the inputs form is when you're editing your workflow. But we wrote this workflow. We know what it's asking for here. It's asking us to pick the time and date we want the hello world workflow to run. So we'll come over here and click the blank field here. And as you can see, it popped up the same sort of interface that we saw when we scheduled hello world manually. So again, in this section here, I pick the date that I want the workflow to run, and I can choose the hour and minutes at which I want the workflow to run. Just to make certain I catch this here, let me bump this up to 2300 hours. I'll click run. And the workflow, you'll notice, has immediately hit the end schema element. But if we close, and I'm rushing here, let me close again. If I go over to workflows runs, I can see that my workflow is done running, it's completed, but I don't see anything here about the hello world workflow. Well, that's simply because I haven't given I haven't let enough time elapse. So let's wait a few moments here, or better yet, let's use some video editing magic and we'll jump ahead in the future. Here we go. Okay, we're back. I've given Orchestrator a few minutes to let some time elapse, and what I'm going to do now is click the refresh button here. And as you can see, the hello world workflow was launched at the precise time we specified. So I said to launch it at 2300 hours, which is also known as 11 p.m. And voila, we have created a workflow that programmatically scheduled another workflow. Again, in our particular case here, this is the workflow that we created, and it programmatically launched this other workflow called Hello World. Now, if you'd like, we're going to do a quick recap here. On the other hand, if you're ready to see the next video in this series, just jump to the end of the video and you'll see a little card on the screen that helps you to jump around between the videos in the series. But let's take a look again real quickly at what we created here. So I'm going to go to Library Workflows, and under Library Workflows, this is the workflow we created. This workflow calls this other workflow called Hello World. Let's take a look at the workflow we created by opening it. And again, what we did was we added to our schema a schema element whose name we changed to say hello in the future, but that's actually a scheduled workflow. We've changed its name now. If we look at this schedule workflow, when you use schedule workflow, you have the usual fields up here that you specify, but in a scheduled workflow, there's this section here labeled options, which has two pieces of information that we need to deal with, both of which are defined by the scheduled workflow. So scheduled workflow wants us as input to schedule workflow to set up a date object that specifies the time and the date in the future when we want our workflow to run. And as you can see here, the variable as it's, the input that's defined by this schedule workflow is called workflow schedule date. And I happen to have created in my workflow an input with the exact same name. Those names don't have to match, but in this case, it made it simpler. The next thing that we need to do is to catch the output from the schedule workflow schema element. So it has an output it calls scheduled task, which is a orchestrator, not a vCenter, but an orchestrator task object. And we created in our case, we could have created an output. We have to create a variable called the exact same thing so that we could catch the task object. That's useful if we want to keep track of the scheduled task. That task object, if you look it up in the API Explorer, contains information such as, is this scheduled task complete? Or is it still pending? Or is it running? Or what's up with it? And then in a scheduled workflow, you always have to specify what workflow it is that you want to schedule. So in our case here, we picked a simple workflow called Hello World, which has no inputs, but whatever workflow we say we're scheduling, Orchestrator is going to go out and find what inputs that workflow defines. And it would insist that we specify those inputs here. Now, you might expect there to be another section here that talks about the outputs of the workflow that we're calling, but when you use schedule workflow, even though VRO knows what both the inputs and outputs are for this workflow that we're scheduling, you're never going to see an output section here because by the time the scheduled workflow is done running, the workflow that we're creating here may be done already. So there's no point in catching outputs there. Instead, if you need the outputs of the scheduled workflow, you need to go through that task object. And that essentially is almost everything that you need to know about in terms of using the schedule workflow schema element. There is one other thing you need to know, which is how to perform date arithmetic, which is something that we'll be talking about in a future video. But in the meantime, if you'd like to take a look into that, the reason why I'm mentioning date arithmetic is instead of setting up the time and date in the future when the workflow is going to run as an input, you could instead use something such as a scriptable task to create that date object and set it. But in order to do so, you're going to need to know how to do JavaScript date object arithmetic. So if you don't want to jump ahead to the video, you can instead just go online and use the search engine to search for something like tutorial JavaScript date object arithmetic. Join me in the next video where I'll show you how to use a scriptable task to cause your workflow to sleep.